The sound of porcelain exploding against hardwood floors pierced through our kitchen. As my overnight bag sailed through the air, landing with a wet thud on our cobblestone driveway. Cold November rain immediately began soaking through the canvas fabric as I stood there in complete shock, watching my husband of 14 years slam the heavy oak door of our Maplewood Heights home. The house I had helped him secure with my teacher's salary. The life I had painstakingly built alongside him for over a decade. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is something truly special. I can't wait to share. Pack the rest of your things and disappear, Charlotte, were Marcus's final venomous words, his voice echoing from behind the door I could no longer call my own. I never want to see your pathetic face again. Little did Marcus know that the certified letter I had received just that morning would change absolutely everything, not just for me, but would turn his entire world upside down in ways his rage-clouded mind could never imagine. But before we dive deeper into this incredible journey of betrayal, revelation, and ultimate triumph, I want you to do something for me. Let me know in the comments below where you're watching this story unfold from. Are you in your car, during lunch break, lying in bed scrolling late at night, or maybe listening while you're doing household chores? I genuinely love connecting with all of you, and your stories inspire me to keep sharing these real-life experiences. And if this beginning already has your heart racing, please hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story is going to be something absolutely extraordinary. I promise you won't want to miss what happens when someone's carefully constructed lies finally catch up with them. Now, let me take you back to that devastating moment and tell you exactly how I ended up standing in the freezing rain, completely homeless, while sitting on a secret that would make Marcus's head spin. My name is Charlotte Whitmore, and at 41 years old, I never in my wildest nightmares imagined I would find myself locked out of my own home by the man who had once stood at an altar and sworn before God and our families to love, honor, and protect me for the rest of our lives. The bitter irony that would soon unfold was that just hours before Marcus's explosive rage tore our marriage apart at the seams, I had received life-changing news that would have solved every single one of his financial problems, the very same money troubles that had triggered his violent outburst in the first place. Standing there on Willowbrook Lane, rain streaming down my face and mixing with tears I refused to acknowledge, I pulled my trembling phone from my coat pocket. The screen still displayed the official email that had arrived at exactly 9:47 that morning, an email that had made me read the same paragraph 5 times before the reality finally sank in. Dear Ms. Whitmore, we are delighted to inform you that the estate settlement of Helena Blackthorne has been finalized. As the sole designated beneficiary, you are now entitled to receive the sum of $4.2 million, plus additional property assets currently valued at approximately $2.8 million. Please contact our offices at your earliest convenience to begin the transfer process. Helena Blackthorne, my mother's mysterious older sister who had vanished from our family's life nearly 3 decades ago after a bitter falling out that no one ever fully explained to me. The same aunt that Marcus had always dismissed with an eye roll and a sneer, calling her that crazy old woman who probably died penniless in some European commune. The very same aunt who, according to Marcus's cruel words, had been a complete waste of time to even think about during her final months battling cancer. Thunder rumbled ominously overhead as I stood there on the sidewalk like a woman possessed, rain soaking through my wool coat and seeping into my bones. I could see Mrs. Patterson's kitchen curtains twitching from across the street, my nosy neighbor undoubtedly getting a front row seat. To witness my complete and utter humiliation, I gathered whatever shreds of dignity I could still muster and dragged my waterlogged bag toward my silver Honda Civic, the car Marcus had graciously allowed me to drive but had never let me forget was registered in his name only. Marcus's fury had been building like a dangerous storm for the past several weeks. The architectural firm where he worked as a senior project manager had been hemorrhaging clients. Major contracts were falling through left and right, and rumors of massive layoffs had been circulating through his office like wildfire. The stress had transformed the man I married into someone I barely recognized. The thoughtful husband who used to surprise me with my favorite lavender tea and spontaneous weekend trips to the mountains had morphed into a stranger, irritable and distant, with an increasingly volatile temper that seemed to explode at the smallest provocation. Tonight had been the catastrophic breaking point that shattered everything. I had simply suggested, as gently as I possibly could, that we might need to consider putting our house on the market if his financial situation continued to deteriorate. Maybe downsizing temporarily wouldn't be the end of the world, I had said, trying desperately to be practical and supportive. We could rebuild from there, start fresh. But the look that crossed Marcus's face in that moment was something I had never seen before. It shifted from frustration to something much darker, much more dangerous. Downsizing? He had snarled, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Are you completely out of your mind, Charlotte? This is what I get for marrying someone with absolutely zero ambition. Someone who gives up and runs at the first sign of real trouble. And that was just the beginning of the end. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you. So if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. Alright, let's get back to it. I had tried to explain that I wasn't giving up, that I was simply being realistic about our options. But Marcus was already beyond the point of listening to reason. Years of buried resentment came pouring out like poison from a burst dam. How? My career as a high school art teacher was just glorified babysitting. How I had never truly contributed anything meaningful to our lifestyle or social status. How his colleagues at Brennan and Associates probably laughed behind his back about his wife, who played with finger paints all day instead of pursuing a real career that could actually help during a financial crisis. When I finally found the courage to suggest that perhaps we needed some time apart to think things through clearly, something fundamental inside Marcus snapped completely. The antique ceramic vase, a wedding gift from his pretentious mother, went flying across our kitchen, shattering against the granite backsplash I had spent months selecting. Then came our framed wedding photo, the one from our honeymoon in Tuscany, sailing through the air and exploding against the hardwood floors. With each crash and explosion, I watched the illusion of our perfect marriage disintegrating before my very eyes. If you want out so badly, then get the hell out, Marcus had screamed, his face red with fury as he stormed up our carpeted staircase. He returned just minutes later, dragging my old leather overnight bag, hastily stuffed with random pieces of my clothing, some of it still bearing the hangers he had ripped them from in his haste. Before my brain could even process what was happening, he was physically pushing me toward our front door, my belongings flying after me like debris from a tornado now. Sitting in my car with the heater running at full blast and my hands still trembling from shock, I scrolled through my phone contacts, desperately trying to figure out who I could possibly call. My best friend Jessica was currently somewhere in Europe, on her long-planned anniversary trip with her husband. My younger sister Samantha lived in a cramped studio apartment in downtown Portland, with barely enough space for herself, let alone a surprise house guest. My parents had retired to their dream cabin in the mountains of Colorado 3 years ago, living their golden years in peaceful isolation. I had always been the stable one in our social circle, the reliable friend with the solid marriage and the beautiful home that everyone envied. I was the one others called when their relationships hit rough patches, the one who hosted dinner parties and holiday gatherings, the one everyone assumed had her life perfectly figured out. How could I possibly admit to any of them that it had all been an elaborate illusion? A house of cards that had just collapsed with spectacular devastation? I started driving aimlessly through the familiar streets of Willowbrook, windshield wipers fighting against the relentless downpour, until I found myself pulling into the parking lot of the Grandview Inn. It wasn't exactly the Ritz-Carlton, but it was clean, reasonably priced, and most importantly, completely anonymous. Perfect for someone whose entire life had just imploded in the span of 30 minutes. The young man working the night shift at the front desk barely glanced up from his computer screen as I checked in, for which I was infinitely grateful. I didn't want to explain my rain-soaked appearance, the mascara streaks I could feel running down my cheeks, or why a woman my age was checking into a budget hotel alone on a Tuesday night with nothing but an overnight bag and a shattered heart. Room 247 was small but impeccably clean. I dropped my bag on the industrial carpet and collapsed onto the edge of the queen-sized bed, finally allowing myself to feel the full, crushing weight of what had just happened to my life. My marriage of 14 years was over. Not just struggling, not just going through a rough patch that we could work through with counseling and effort. It was completely, irrevocably finished. The warning signs had been there for years, glaring red flags that I had chosen to ignore or rationalize away. Marcus's need to control every aspect of our finances, never allowing me access to our investment accounts or even our monthly budget spreadsheets. His dismissive attitude toward my teaching career, constantly suggesting I should pursue something more lucrative like corporate training or educational consulting. His increasingly frequent outbursts when things didn't go exactly according to his carefully laid plans, followed by elaborate apologies and promises that it would never happen again. But I had chosen willful blindness, convinced that every marriage had its challenges, that his behavior was just stress-related and temporary. I had made excuses, adapted my own behavior to avoid triggering his anger, and slowly, imperceptibly, made myself smaller and smaller to fit into the narrow space he had carved out for me. In his meticulously controlled world, I reached for my phone again, opening that life-changing email about Aunt Helena's inheritance. The reality of my situation was beginning to sink in like dawn breaking over a new landscape. I was not destitute or helpless. I was not trapped or dependent on Marcus's goodwill for survival. In fact, I now had more financial security and independence than Marcus could even dream of achieving in his wildest fantasies. The irony was so sharp it nearly took my breath away. Aunt Helena had been a complete enigma in our family constellation for as long as I could remember. After a bitter and explosive falling out with my mother nearly 30 years ago, something involving family money, broken promises, and harsh words that could never be taken back, she had essentially vanished from our lives, building what we later learned was an incredibly successful luxury event planning empire across Europe. When Helena was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer 8 months ago, I was the only family member who made the difficult journey to Geneva to be with her during her final weeks. Not because I had any expectation of financial gain, I genuinely had no idea she possessed any significant wealth. I went simply because I believed in my heart that no one should face death completely alone, regardless of ancient family feuds that had nothing to do with me. We had spent nearly a month together in her elegant lakeside apartment, reconnecting and healing old wounds as she shared incredible stories of her adventurous, unconventional life. Tales of organizing weddings for European royalty, managing corporate retreats in Swiss castles, and building business relationships that spanned 3 continents. Helena had never married, never had children, but she had created a life of absolute freedom and financial independence that she had crafted entirely on her own terms. "Never let anyone clip your wings, Charlotte," she had told me one afternoon, her voice growing weak but her piercing blue eyes still blazing with fierce determination. I stayed away from this family for decades because they wanted me to be smaller, quieter, more conventional. They couldn't understand that a woman could build something magnificent without a man's permission or approval. She paused, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't waste precious years trying to please people who can't see your true worth." I had nodded politely, listening but not truly absorbing the deeper meaning behind her words. Now, sitting in this anonymous hotel room, emotionally raw and physically drained, those conversations echoed in my mind with crystal clear significance. Helena hadn't just been sharing memories. She had been preparing me for this exact moment. A soft notification chime on my phone broke through my spiraling thoughts. 3 missed calls from Marcus, and a text message that made my stomach clench. "Charlotte, I'm sorry. Come home immediately so we can discuss this rationally like adults. We can work through this together." I stared at the message, my finger hovering uncertainly over the reply button. The old Charlotte, the woman who had spent 14 years walking on eggshells, constantly adjusting her behavior to avoid triggering Marcus's unpredictable temper, would have rushed back home immediately. The old Charlotte would have accepted his hollow apology without question, quietly cleaned up all the shattered ceramic and glass while he watched television, and tried even harder to be the perfect, undemanding wife he seemed to require. But, sitting in that sterile hotel room, soaked to the bone and emotionally devastated, I realized with startling clarity that I wasn't that version of myself anymore. And Helena's final gift to me wasn't just the financial security that would change my life forever. It was the courage and perspective I needed to finally see the truth about my marriage. With unflinching honesty, I placed my phone on the scratched nightstand without responding to Marcus's message and walked slowly to the small bathroom. As steam began filling the cramped space from the hot shower, I caught my reflection in the foggy mirror. Beneath the smeared makeup, tangled hair, and exhaustion, I could see something I hadn't noticed in years. A small but unmistakable spark of determination, of possibility, of strength I had forgotten I possessed. Helena had seen it too. During those precious weeks in Geneva, she had recognized something in me that I had lost sight of completely. The woman I used to be, before I started systematically shrinking myself to fit into Marcus's narrow vision of who I should become. The inheritance wasn't just money sitting in some distant bank account. It represented choices I had never imagined having, freedom I had stopped believing was possible, and the power to finally live life according to my own values and dreams, instead of constantly adapting to someone else's demands and expectations. As I stepped into the scalding shower, letting the hot water wash away the trauma and humiliation of the evening, I made a decision that would change everything. Marcus had kicked me out thinking I had nowhere to go, no resources of my own, no options. except to come crawling back and beg for his forgiveness and another chance. He had absolutely no idea what was coming next. And for the first time in 14 long years, neither did I. But I was finally ready to discover who Charlotte Whitmore could become. When she stopped asking for permission to exist, the water cascaded over me as I stood there, washing away not just the rain and tears, but years of doubt, compromise, and self-diminishment. Tomorrow, I would start building something new from the ashes of my old life. Tonight, I would simply let myself imagine what true freedom might actually feel like. Helena's words rang in my ears like a battle cry. Don't waste precious years trying to please people who can't see your true worth. Those days were officially over. I woke the next morning in the unfamiliar hotel bed, momentarily disoriented by the muffled sounds of housekeeping carts rolling down hallways and the distant hum of highway traffic. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back like a tsunami. Marcus's explosive rage, the inheritance revelation, my new reality as a suddenly homeless woman sitting on a fortune that could change everything. For a moment, I pulled the scratchy hotel comforter over my head, tempted to hide from this new world just a little longer. My phone buzzed insistently with another text from Marcus. Charlotte, please. I was completely out of my mind with stress last night. You know I didn't mean any of those terrible things I said. We need to talk about this properly. I set the phone down without responding, forcing myself to look back at our relationship with the clarity that only distance and shock can provide. How many times had this exact cycle repeated itself over the years? Marcus's volcanic temper would explode without warning, followed by profuse apologies, promises to change, sometimes even expensive jewelry or elaborate weekend getaways to smooth things over. Each time, I had convinced myself it was just the pressure from work, just a temporary phase, just a momentary lapse in an otherwise solid marriage. But had it really been solid? As I showered and dressed in one of the few outfits Marcus had hastily thrown into my bag, a simple black sweater and jeans that now felt like armor, I forced myself to examine our history with brutal honesty. Marcus and I had met 16 years ago at a charity art auction where I was displaying several watercolor pieces I had created to benefit the local children's hospital. He was there representing Brennan and Associates, schmoozing potential clients while looking devastatingly handsome in his tailored navy suit. He had been absolutely charming that night, genuinely captivated by my artwork, asking intelligent questions about my techniques and artistic influences. These are absolutely extraordinary, he had said, studying my paintings with what seemed like sincere appreciation. You have an incredible gift for capturing emotion in color. Have you ever considered doing commissioned work for corporate clients? For someone who had grown up hearing that art was a lovely hobby but not a real career path, Marcus's validation had been intoxicating. Here was this successful, sophisticated man who not only appreciated my work but saw commercial potential in it. We were engaged within 18 months and married 6 months after that, settling into our beautiful colonial home in Maplewood Heights, a house that stretched my teacher's salary to its absolute limit but that Marcus insisted we deserved if we wanted to be taken seriously in his professional circles. The first warning signs had appeared so gradually, so subtly, that I hadn't recognized them as red flags at all. Comments about my little paintings when speaking to his colleagues at dinner parties. Gentle but persistent suggestions that I should focus on more lucrative commercial design work, rather than the children's book illustrations that brought me genuine joy. Subtle pressure to consider leaving teaching for a real corporate position during his firm's First major financial downturn. You could do graphic design for pharmaceutical companies. He had suggested one evening over dinner, his tone reasonable and caring. That's where the serious money is, Charlotte. We need to be practical about our future. I had compromised, taking on freelance corporate projects that drain my creative energy while relegating my passion. Projects to stolen moments in early mornings and late nights. Marcus called it being responsible adults. Now I could see it for what it really was. The systematic erosion of my identity, one small concession at a time. The financial control had been equally gradual and insidious. When we got married, Marcus had suggested combining our finances for simplicity. He was better with numbers, he argued, better at long-term financial planning and investment strategies. It made sense for him to handle our budget, our savings, our retirement planning. I could focus on my teaching and art while he managed the serious business of our financial future. What had seemed like a practical division of labor had slowly become a cage. I had no access to our investment accounts, no visibility into our monthly expenses, no say in major financial decisions. When I received payment for my freelance work, the checks went directly into our account, which Marcus monitored and controlled completely. If I needed money for art supplies or wanted to buy a gift for a friend, I had to ask permission like a teenager requesting an allowance. Why do you need 3 different types of watercolor brushes? He would ask, reviewing my purchases with the scrutiny of an IRS auditor. Can't you just use the ones you already have? I had adapted, learned to justify every expense, to make my needs as small and undemanding as possible. I told myself it was just his practical nature, his responsible approach to money management. I never questioned why he could spend $100 on a business lunch without discussion, while I needed approval for a $30 art book. The emotional manipulation had been even more subtle. Marcus had a gift for making me question my own perceptions, my own feelings, even my own memories. When I tried to address his increasingly frequent outbursts, he would turn it back on me. I only get frustrated because I care so much about our future, he would say, his voice gentle and reasonable. You're too sensitive, Charlotte. You take everything so personally. I'm trying to build something for us, and instead of supporting me, you focus on these tiny details. Gradually, I had learned to doubt myself, to second-guess my reactions, to blame myself for his anger. If I was more supportive, more understanding, more grateful for everything he provided, maybe he wouldn't get so stressed. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was asking for too much. Looking back now, I could see the pattern with crystal clarity. The isolation from friends who might have offered different perspectives. The gradual undermining of my confidence and independence. The financial control that made leaving seem impossible. The emotional manipulation that made me question whether his behavior was actually problematic, or if I was just being dramatic. Marcus hadn't woken up one day and decided to become controlling and abusive. It had been a slow, methodical process, like a frog being slowly boiled alive, never noticing the water getting hotter until it was too late to jump out. But Aunt Helena had seen it all during those weeks in Geneva. She had recognized the signs because she had watched the same pattern destroy my mother's spirit. The same way my grandfather had systematically diminished my grandmother, until she became a shadow of her former self. Powerful men often marry women they can mold, Helena had told me one afternoon as we sat by Lake Geneva, watching sailboats glide across the pristine water. They want wives who will make them look good, who will support their ambitions without having inconvenient dreams of their own. At the time, I had thought she was talking about ancient history, old family dynamics that had nothing to do with my modern marriage. Now I understood she had been trying to warn me, trying to give me the courage to see what was right in front of me. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Marcus. I let it go to voicemail, knowing that whatever message he left would follow the same predictable script. Remorse, promises, subtle blame, and increasing pressure for me to come home and restore his carefully controlled world. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Helena's inheritance hadn't just given me financial freedom. It had given me the power to finally see the truth about my marriage, and the courage to imagine a different kind of life entirely. After checking out of the Grandview Inn, I drove to Rosewood Cafe, a quiet corner spot where I often graded papers while sipping their signature cinnamon spice lattes. The familiar routine felt surreal given that my entire world had shifted overnight. But I needed normalcy while I figured out my next steps. The barista, Kelly, greeted me with her usual warm smile, though I could see her curious glance at my overnight bag. "The usual, Mrs. Whitmore?" she asked, already reaching for a large cup. "Actually, make it a double shot today," I replied, realizing I hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. "And maybe one of those blueberry scones, too." While waiting for my order, I opened my laptop and reread the inheritance email, this time paying attention to every detail. The inheritance wasn't just the monetary amount. There was also a property, a 4-bedroom Victorian house overlooking Crescent Harbor, plus an extensive collection of antiques and artwork currently in climate-controlled storage. The attorney handling Helena's estate, Margaret Sinclair, had requested a meeting at my earliest convenience. I typed a quick response asking for an appointment that same afternoon. Within minutes, she replied, 2:30 p.m. would work perfectly. The address is 1847 Harborview Drive, Suite 300. As I sipped my coffee, my phone rang. Marcus again. This time I answered, curious to hear how his strategy might have evolved overnight. "Thank God," he said immediately, his voice a mixture of relief and barely controlled anxiety. "Charlotte, where are you? When are you coming home?" "I'm not coming home, Marcus," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I need time to think about our marriage." "Think about what?" His tone shifted quickly, that familiar edge creeping in. "This is completely insane. You can't just abandon our home, our life together, because we had one argument. One argument." I almost laughed. "Marcus, you physically threw me out of our house and broke our wedding gifts. That's not an argument. That's violence." "Violence?" His voice rose sharply. "I never laid a hand on you, Charlotte. You're being completely dramatic. Where are you even staying? Who are you with?" There it was. The immediate assumption that I must be with someone else. The implication that I couldn't possibly manage on my own. The same accusation that surfaced whenever I asserted any independence. A projection I now recognized as his own guilty conscience speaking. "I'm alone, Marcus, and I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." "Taking care of yourself with what money?" he snapped, and I could practically see him pacing our kitchen, running his hands through his hair. In that agitated way. "You have access to what? Maybe $300 in your personal checking account. How long do you think that's going to last?" His smugness was breathtaking. He genuinely believed that financial leverage would force me back into compliance, just like it always had before. "I'll figure it out," I said simply. "You'll figure it out." Marcus's voice cracked with incredulous anger. "Charlotte, you teach high school art classes. You make barely $40,000 a year. You have no credit cards in your own name, no savings account I don't monitor. What exactly do you think you're going to figure out?" Each word was calculated to remind me of my dependence, my vulnerability, my supposed helplessness without him. In the past, this recitation of my financial limitations would have sent me into a panic, would have driven me straight back to our front door with apologies and promises to be more grateful. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I said, "I'll figure it out, Marcus." "This is ridiculous," he continued, his voice getting louder. "Just come home and we can discuss this like rational adults. I'm under incredible pressure at work. The Peterson account fell through yesterday, and there are rumors about another round of layoffs. Instead of supporting me through this crisis, you're making everything 10 times worse." There was the familiar script. His problems became my fault. His stress justified his behavior, and my need for basic respect was somehow selfish and unsupportive. "I'm going to hang up now," I said quietly. "Charlotte, don't you dare." I ended the call and immediately blocked his number. The silence that followed felt like emerging from underwater after holding my breath for years. But Marcus wasn't finished. Within an hour, my phone was buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize, clearly him calling from other phones. When I stopped answering those, the real escalation began. First came the email to my school account, which I hadn't thought to block. "Charlotte's behavior has become extremely concerning. She's abandoned our home and is refusing to communicate rationally. I'm worried she may be having some kind of mental health crisis. If anyone has seen her or knows where she's staying, please contact me immediately." Marcus Whitmore. The message had been sent to my principal, Dr. Roberts, and copied to several of my teaching colleagues. My stomach dropped as I realized the implications. Marcus was trying to paint me as unstable, potentially unfit to teach, using my professional reputation as leverage to force me back. Then came the call from my mother. "Charlotte, what on earth is going on?" My mother's voice was sharp with worry and disapproval. "Marcus called us this morning, absolutely beside himself. He says you've run off without any explanation, that you're not responding to his calls. He's terrified something terrible has happened to you." I closed my eyes, recognizing Marcus's manipulation extending into my family relationships. "Nothing terrible has happened, Mom. Marcus and I had a serious argument, and I've decided I need some space to think." "Space to think about what?" she demanded. "Charlotte, you've been married for 14 years. Marriages go through difficult periods. That's normal. You don't just run away like a teenager having a tantrum. He didn't tell you that he threw me out of the house? That he broke our wedding gifts and physically pushed me toward the door?" There was a pause. "Well, he mentioned you two had a heated discussion about finances, and things got emotional. But Charlotte, you know how stressed he's been about work. Sometimes men express frustration differently than women do." "That doesn't mean, Mom," I interrupted. "Would you accept Dad treating you that way?" "That's completely different," she said quickly. "Your father and I have been married for 45 years. We understand each other. And frankly, your father has never had to deal with the kind of financial pressure Marcus is under." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my mother defending Marcus, minimizing my concerns, and urging me to stop being so dramatic and go home where I belonged. When we finally hung up, I felt emotionally drained but oddly clear about the dynamics I had been living with. Marcus had called in reinforcements. My family, my workplace, probably our mutual friends. He was systematically trying to isolate me, to make me seem unstable and irrational, to use every relationship and institution in my life as pressure points to force my return. It was a masterclass in coercive control, and it might have worked if I was still the financially dependent woman I had been just 24 hours ago. But I wasn't that woman anymore. And Marcus had no idea what was coming next. My phone chimed with another text, this time from a number I didn't recognize. This is getting out of hand, Charlotte. People are starting to ask questions about your mental state. Come home tonight, and we can work this out privately. Or I'll have to take more serious steps to get you the help you obviously need. The threat was crystal clear, and it terrified me more than his anger ever had. Marcus was escalating from emotional manipulation to something far more dangerous, questioning my sanity, my competence, my very right to make decisions about my own life. I forwarded the message to Margaret Sinclair's office with a brief explanation, then drove toward Harborview Drive. It was time to claim the power Helena had left me, and to start fighting back. The law offices of Sinclair and Associates occupied an elegant restored brick building in the historic Harbor District, with ivy-covered walls and gleaming brass fixtures that spoke of old money and established power. Margaret Sinclair herself was nothing like I had imagined, younger than me by several years, with vibrant red hair pulled back in a sleek chignon, and an impressive collection of academic degrees displayed behind her mahogany desk. You must be Charlotte, she said, greeting me with a firm handshake and genuine warmth. Helena spoke about you constantly during our meetings. She was incredibly proud of the woman you'd become, and absolutely furious about the man you'd married. She was? I asked, following Margaret into her spacious conference room, where thick folders were already arranged on the polished table. Oh, yes. Margaret smiled sadly as we settled into leather chairs. Helena had very strong opinions about controlling men and the women who love them. She saw herself in you, I think. The artistic spirit, the generous heart, the tendency to make yourself smaller to keep the peace. As Margaret began outlining the inheritance details, I struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what Helena had left me beyond the monetary assets. There was the Victorian house, completely furnished and maintained by a property management company Helena had contracted. The art collection alone was worth nearly $1 million, featuring pieces she had acquired over decades of international travel. There were also business assets, partial ownership in 3 successful event planning companies across Europe, generating substantial quarterly income. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret said, sliding a sealed envelope across the table, Helena left you this letter. She was very specific that you should read it privately, in your own time. However, given what you've shared about your current situation, I think you should read it now. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded several pages of Helena's elegant handwriting. My dearest Charlotte, if you're reading this, our time together has ended. But what I hope to give you is just beginning. Not just financial security, but the freedom I found too late in my own life. I recognized myself in you from the moment you arrived in Geneva. The way you apologized for everything, how you checked your phone constantly, worried about disappointing a husband who should have been grateful you were there at all. I saw the faint bruises on your wrists that you thought were hidden by your bracelets. I watched how you flinched when your phone rang, how you rehearsed conversations before making calls. I recognized the signs because I watched the same patterns destroy your grandmother, just as they nearly destroyed your mother before she found the strength to leave your father. This inheritance represents my life's work and freedom. Use it too. Find yours. The house in Crescent Harbor was my secret sanctuary. No one knows about it except Margaret and the property managers. It's yours now, a place to breathe, to think, to remember who you were before someone else started defining your worth. Most importantly, Charlotte, I've arranged for you to have the best legal protection available. Margaret specializes in high conflict divorces and has connections throughout the legal community. The financial accounts are structured as an irrevocable trust, meaning no husband, current or future, can ever access these funds. I learned from watching too many women lose everything they'd built. Be braver than I was, my dear. Be braver than your mother was. Use this gift to write a completely different ending to your story. Tears streamed down my face as I finished reading. Helena hadn't just left me money. She had created an entire escape plan, complete with legal protections and emotional support I hadn't even known I needed. She set this up months before her death, Margaret explained gently, handing me tissues. Helena was very thorough in her planning. She also connected me with Dr. Sarah Chen, a therapist who specializes in helping women recover from emotionally abusive relationships, and Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who works with the Domestic Violence Unit. Domestic violence? I asked, startled. But Marcus never actually hit me. Margaret's expression grew serious. Emotional abuse, financial control, threats of involuntary commitment. These are all forms of domestic violence, Charlotte. The fact that he hasn't escalated to physical violence yet doesn't mean you're safe. In fact, the period when a woman leaves is often when these situations become most dangerous. She showed me the texts Marcus had been sending, which I had forwarded to her office. Margaret's legal assistant had been documenting everything, creating a timeline of escalating threats and manipulation. We need to get you a restraining order immediately, Margaret continued. And I'm going to connect you with my colleague, David Park, who handles high-asset divorces. Given Marcus's behavior and the size of your inheritance, we need to move quickly to protect your interests. Within an hour, Margaret had made 3 phone calls that would change everything. Dr. Chen could see me the following morning. Detective Rodriguez would meet us at the police station that afternoon to file a formal complaint about Marcus's threatening behavior. David Park would begin divorce proceedings immediately, including emergency financial protections. One more thing, Margaret said as she walked me to the elevator. Helena mentioned that you're an artist. There's a studio space in the harbor house. She had it specially designed for creative work. She hoped you might use it. As I drove toward Crescent Harbor to see the house for the first time, my phone buzzed with yet another call from an unknown number. This time, when I answered, it wasn't Marcus, Mrs. Whitmore. This is Dr. James Bennett from Willowbrook Medical Center. Your husband has asked me to conduct a psychiatric evaluation. He's concerned about your recent erratic behavior and believes you may need professional intervention. My blood ran cold. Marcus had actually followed through on his threat, contacting a psychiatrist to question my mental competence. Dr. Bennett, I said carefully, I haven't requested any evaluation, and I don't consent to one. Who exactly are you, and how did you get my number? There was a pause. Well, your husband provided your contact information. He's described some concerning symptoms: abandoning your home, refusing to communicate, making irrational financial decisions. These could indicate a serious mental health crisis. What irrational financial decisions? I asked, genuinely curious about what Marcus might have told him. He mentioned you've been talking about having access to large sums of money that don't exist, which could indicate delusions of grandeur or a break from reality. I almost laughed. Marcus had turned my inheritance into evidence of mental illness, not knowing that every word of it was completely true. Dr. Bennett, I'm going to be very clear with you. I am not your patient. I have not requested your services, and any further contact without my consent would be inappropriate. If you continue to call me based on third-party reports, I'll be filing a complaint with the medical board. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you may feel defensive, but I hung up and immediately called Margaret Sinclair. He's escalating faster than I expected, Margaret said after I explained the call. This is a classic intimidation tactic, using medical authority to question your competence. We need to document this immediately and get that restraining order filed today, not tomorrow. An hour later, I stood in the driveway of 247 Ocean View Lane, staring at what was now my house. The Victorian was breathtaking, painted in soft sage green with white trim, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens that overlooked the harbor. Wind chimes played gentle melodies on the wraparound porch, and I could see the studio Margaret had mentioned through large windows on the second floor. As I unlocked the front door with the key Margaret had given me, my phone rang one final time. This time it was Jessica, my best friend, calling from somewhere in Italy. Charlotte, I just got the strangest call from Marcus. He says you've disappeared and he's worried you might hurt yourself. What's going on? Even from thousands of miles away, Marcus was mobilizing our mutual friends, painting me as unstable and potentially suicidal. Jess, I said, walking through my new home and marveling at its beauty. I need to tell you some things about my marriage that I've never been able to say before. For the next hour, I sat on Helena's, my, living room couch, overlooking the harbor, and told my best friend the truth about the last 14 years. About the control, the manipulation, the gradual erosion of my independence and self-worth. Oh my God, Charlotte, Jessica whispered when I finished. I had no idea, but now that you're saying it, there were signs. The way you always had to check with him before making plans, how you stopped talking about your art dreams, the way you seemed to get smaller every year. I couldn't see it while I was living it, I admitted, but I'm seeing it now. What can I do to help? She asked immediately. Just believe me, I said. When Marcus calls our other friends, when he tries to convince everyone I'm having a breakdown, just remember this conversation. By evening, I had a restraining order filed, a divorce attorney retained, a therapy appointment scheduled, and for the first time in years, a home that was entirely mine. Helena's final gift wasn't just financial freedom. It was the support system I needed to claim that freedom safely. Marcus had tried to isolate me, but instead, he had driven me toward people who could actually help me build a new life. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight streaming through the lace curtains of my new bedroom. As seagulls called from the harbor below, I had slept better than I had in months, finally free from the constant tension of monitoring Marcus's moods and adjusting my behavior accordingly. The house felt like a sanctuary Helena had specifically designed for healing, filled with natural light, original hardwood floors, and an overwhelming sense of peace. My appointment with Dr. Sarah Chen was scheduled for 9 a.m. at her office in downtown Willowbrook. As I prepared for what would be my first therapy session ever, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The police report you filed is a matter of public record now. Everyone will see what a vindictive liar you really are. This isn't over, Charlotte. Instead of the familiar spike of anxiety Marcus's threats used to trigger, I felt something entirely different, a cold, focused anger. He was still trying to intimidate me. But now I had people in my corner who understood exactly what he was doing. I forwarded the message to Margaret and Detective Rodriguez, adding it to the growing documentation of his harassment. Dr. Chen's office was located in a converted brownstone, with soft lighting and comfortable furniture that immediately put me at ease. Sarah herself was in her early 50s, with kind eyes and an air of calm competence that reminded me of Helena. Margaret told me a bit about your situation, she began after we settled into facing armchairs. But I'd like to hear your story in your own words. Take as much time as you need. For the next hour, I found myself speaking truths I had never voiced aloud. How I had gradually stopped making plans with friends without checking Marcus's schedule first. How I had learned to gauge his mood from the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, adjusting my own behavior to avoid triggering his anger. How I had convinced myself that walking on eggshells was just part of being a supportive wife. What you're describing is called coercive control, Dr. Chen explained gently. It's a pattern of behavior designed to make you dependent and compliant. The fact that you can see it clearly now shows incredible strength and self-awareness. But I stayed for 14 years, I said, shame creeping into my voice. I made excuses for him, adapted to his demands. Doesn't that make me weak? Charlotte, Dr. Chen leaned forward, her voice firm but compassionate. Survival isn't weakness. You developed coping mechanisms that kept you safe in an impossible situation. Now you're in a position to make different choices, and you're making them. That takes tremendous courage. As I left Dr. Chen's office, I felt lighter somehow, as if speaking the truth had literally lifted a weight from my shoulders. My phone rang as I reached my car. David Park, the divorce attorney Margaret had recommended. Mrs. Whitmore, I've reviewed the documentation Margaret sent over, and I need to meet with you today if possible. Your husband filed a counterpetition this morning, and there are some concerning elements we need to address immediately. An hour later, I sat in David's sleek office as he explained Marcus's legal strategy. He was claiming that I had abandoned our marriage, stolen marital property, and was suffering from a mental breakdown that rendered me incapable of making rational decisions about our shared assets. He's also requesting that the court freeze any accounts you may have opened and require a psychiatric evaluation before proceeding with divorce negotiations. David continued, his expression grim. It's a scorched earth approach designed to control the narrative and force you back into compliance. Can he do that? I asked, feeling a familiar flutter of panic. He can try, David replied, but he's made several critical mistakes. First, your inheritance is clearly separate property, established before he knew about it. Second, his own threatening texts and the restraining order we filed establish a pattern of intimidation. And third, his attempt to weaponize mental health services actually works in our favor. It shows consciousness of guilt and manipulative intent. David explained our counterstrategy. We would file an emergency motion seeking temporary spousal support, exclusive use of the marital home, and sanctions against Marcus for frivolous filings designed to harass me. More importantly, we would present evidence of his financial control and emotional abuse to establish grounds for a substantial settlement. The key, David said, is that we don't just defend against his attacks. We go on the offensive. Men, like your husband, count on their victims being too intimidated or ashamed to fight back. When you stand up for yourself legally, it often stops them in their tracks. That afternoon, I met Detective Rodriguez at the Willowbrook police station to provide a formal statement about Marcus's escalating harassment. Lisa Rodriguez was a compact woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that inspired immediate confidence. "I've seen this pattern hundreds of times," she told me as we reviewed the threatening messages. "The fake concern for your mental health, the attempts to involve your workplace and family, the gradual escalation of control tactics. It's textbook coercive behavior. The good news is that his own communications are building our case for us." Detective Rodriguez explained that they would be investigating Marcus's contact with Dr. Bennett as using medical professionals to intimidate domestic violence victims was both unethical and potentially illegal. She also arranged for increased patrol coverage around both my new home and my workplace. "Many women don't report this kind of psychological abuse because they think police only handle physical violence," she said. "But emotional terrorism is still terrorism. We take it seriously here." By late afternoon, I was back at the Harbor House, sitting in Helena's art studio for the first time. The space was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water, professional-grade easels and supplies, storage for canvases and materials. It was clear Helena had designed this room with me specifically in mind. I found myself picking up a brush for the first time in months, mixing colors on a palette as the afternoon light shifted across the harbor. Without any conscious plan, I began painting, not the careful, controlled illustrations I had been creating for years, but something raw and emotional. Bold strokes of deep blues and stormy grays, punctuated by brilliant flashes of gold and red. As I painted, my phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Marcus had apparently escalated his campaign, posting on social media about his missing wife and her concerning behavior. Several mutual friends had reached out, asking if I was okay and offering support. Though I could tell some were skeptical about my version of events. But for every person Marcus managed to turn against me, there was someone else stepping forward to help. My teaching colleague Maria sent a supportive text, mentioning that she had always sensed something wasn't right about Marcus's possessive behavior at school events. My neighbor from Maplewood Heights called to say she had witnessed Marcus throwing my belongings outside and was willing to provide a statement if needed. Most surprisingly, my sister Samantha called from Portland. "Charlotte, I just got off the phone with Mom, and I told her she was completely wrong to take Marcus's side," Samantha said without preamble. "I remember how he used to monitor your conversations at family gatherings, how he would answer questions directed at you. I always thought he was controlling, but I didn't know how to say anything." "Why didn't you?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. "Because you seemed happy," she admitted. "Or at least, you said you were happy, and you always defended him when anyone raised concerns. I thought maybe I was just being oversensitive." It was a sobering reminder of how thoroughly I had convinced everyone, including myself, that my marriage was normal and healthy. That evening, as I sat on the deck overlooking the harbor with a cup of tea and Helena's journals, I realized something profound had shifted. For the first time in 14 years, I wasn't afraid of Marcus's anger. I wasn't monitoring my phone for his mood indicators or planning my responses to avoid conflict. Instead, I was surrounded by people who believed me, supported me, and were actively working to protect me. I had resources Marcus couldn't touch, legal protections he couldn't circumvent, and most importantly, I had rediscovered my own voice. Marcus had spent years convincing me that I was helpless without him, that I couldn't survive on my own, that my perceptions were unreliable and my judgment was flawed. But sitting in my beautiful home, with my inheritance secure and my legal team in place, I could see the truth with perfect clarity. I wasn't the helpless victim of his narrative. I was a woman with choices, resources, and the growing determination to use them both. Tomorrow, we would file our counter-motion in court. Next week, I would return to teaching with my head held high. And eventually, I would show Marcus and everyone else exactly who Charlotte Whitmore really was when she stopped asking permission to exist. The frightened woman who had stood in the rain 3 days ago was gone forever. In her place was someone I was just beginning to meet, and I liked her already. The emergency court hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 a.m., just 1 week after Marcus had thrown me out of our home. As I dressed in my most professional navy suit, I could hardly believe how much my life had transformed in such a short time. The woman looking back at me in the mirror was someone I barely recognized. Confident, determined, and backed by the kind of legal firepower that money could buy. David Park had prepared meticulously for this moment. Our motion requested immediate, temporary spousal support, exclusive use of the marital home, and sanctions against Marcus for filing frivolous claims designed to harass and intimidate me. More importantly, we were presenting evidence that would expose the true nature of our marriage to judicial scrutiny. For the first time, remember, David coached me as we walked into the Willowbrook County Courthouse. He's going to try to provoke you. That's his strategy. Make you appear emotional and unstable in front of the judge. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and let the evidence speak for itself. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a harsh, institutional feel. Marcus was already seated at the opposing table, with his attorney, Robert Hutchinson, a man known for aggressive tactics in high-conflict divorces. When Marcus turned to look at me, I was struck by how haggard he appeared. Unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, his usually pristine appearance disheveled. For a moment, our eyes met across the courtroom, and I saw something I had never seen before in his expression. Genuine fear, not of me, but of losing control over the narrative he had spent 14 years carefully constructing. Judge Patricia Holbrook entered, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency. She reviewed the files before her, then looked up with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. This appears to be a motion for emergency relief in divorce proceedings. She began, "Mr. Park, you may present your case." David stood, his presentation crisp and professional. He outlined Marcus's pattern of financial control, showing bank records that demonstrated how my teaching salary had been systematically diverted into accounts I couldn't access. He presented the threatening text messages, the attempted psychiatric manipulation, and the campaign to involve my workplace and family in his efforts to force my return. Your Honor, David continued, what we have here is not a marital dispute, but a systematic campaign of coercive control. When Mrs. Whitmore attempted to leave this abusive situation, Mr. Whitmore escalated to threats, harassment, and attempts to have her involuntarily committed rather than address the underlying issues. In their marriage, Marcus's attorney rose to object, but Judge Holbrook silenced him with a raised hand. "I'll hear from you in a moment, Mr. Hutchinson. Continue, Mr. Park." David then presented the documentation of my inheritance, carefully explaining how the funds were held in an irrevocable trust established before Marcus knew of their existence. Mr. Whitmore's claims that his wife is delusional about having access to money are demonstrably false. Your Honor, she is, in fact, financially independent for the first time in her adult life. When David finished, Marcus's attorney launched into what could only be described as a character assassination. According to Hutchinson, I was an unstable woman who had abandoned my marriage during my husband's time of greatest need, stolen marital property, and was now fabricating abuse allegations to justify my selfish behavior. Mrs. Whitmore has a history of depression and anxiety, Hutchinson claimed, despite having no medical records to support this assertion. Her sudden claims of abuse conveniently coincide with her discovery of a substantial inheritance. This appears to be nothing more than a calculated attempt to maximize her financial gain, while destroying my client's reputation. But then Marcus made a critical mistake. Unable to contain himself as his attorney painted me as a gold-digging manipulator, he leaned forward and whispered something urgently in Hutchinson's ear. I could see his agitation building, the same dangerous energy I had learned to recognize over the years. Judge Holbrook noticed too. Mr. Hutchinson, please control your client. Your Honor, Hutchinson continued. My client is understandably emotional about these false allegations. He built their entire lifestyle, supported his wife's career choices even when they weren't financially viable, and has been nothing but generous and patient throughout their marriage. Patient. The word escaped my lips before I could stop it, and Marcus's head snapped toward me with a look of pure rage. She's lying. Marcus suddenly stood up, his voice echoing through the courtroom. Everything she's saying is a lie. I gave her everything: a beautiful home, financial security, a lifestyle she never could have achieved on her teacher's salary. And this is how she repays me? By stealing my car, abandoning our home, and making up stories about abuse. Mr. Whitmore, sit down immediately, Judge Holbrook ordered, her voice stern. But Marcus was beyond listening. 14 years of carefully maintained control were unraveling in real time, and he couldn't stop himself. She's manipulative and ungrateful, Your Honor. She's always been dramatic and oversensitive. I never laid a hand on her, never did anything except try to build a good life for us both. Mr. Whitmore, Judge Holbrook's voice cut through his tirade like a knife. You will sit down and remain silent, or you will be removed from this courtroom. Marcus finally sat, but his hands were shaking with barely contained fury. In less than 2 minutes, he had done more to prove my case than hours of testimony could have accomplished. The mask of the reasonable, concerned husband had slipped completely, revealing the controlling, volatile man underneath. Hutchinson tried to recover, suggesting that his client's outburst was simply the result of extreme stress and false accusations. But the damage was done. Judge Holbrook had seen Marcus's true nature with her own eyes. I've heard enough, the judge announced. Mrs. Whitmore, please approach the bench. My legs felt unsteady as I walked forward, but my voice was clear when she asked if I felt safe returning to the marital home. No, Your Honor, I do not. Mr. Whitmore, Judge Holbrook addressed Marcus directly. Your behavior in this courtroom today has been completely inappropriate and frankly concerning, combined with the evidence presented regarding your threatening communications and attempts to manipulate medical professionals. I'm granting Mrs. Whitmore's motion in its entirety. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. I was awarded temporary spousal support of $5,000 per month, exclusive use of the marital home, and protection from any further contact except through attorneys. Marcus was ordered to undergo anger management counseling before any future court appearances, and Hutchinson was sanctioned for filing frivolous claims about my mental health without supporting evidence. But the most significant moment came as we were leaving the courtroom. Marcus broke away from his attorney and approached me directly. violating the no-contact order that had just been issued. "This isn't over, Charlotte," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "You think you're dead ants. Money makes you powerful. You think you can just destroy my life and walk away? I know things about you that could ruin your precious teaching career. I have photos, emails, things that would make you unemployable." Before I could respond, Courthouse security was intervening, but not before Marcus's threats were heard by multiple witnesses, including a court reporter who had stayed late to finish transcription. As Marcus was escorted from the building, shouting about how I would regret this for the rest of my life, I realized that everything had changed irreversibly. There would be no reconciliation, no going back to our old patterns, no possibility of repair. Marcus had shown his true face not just to me, but to the legal system, and there was no taking it back. David was already on his phone, documenting the violation of the no-contact order and Marcus's new threats. Detective Rodriguez would need to be notified immediately. But as I stood on the courthouse steps, watching my husband of 14 years being driven away by security, I felt something unexpected: relief. For the first time since this nightmare began, I could see clearly that I hadn't just escaped a bad marriage. I had escaped something that could have eventually destroyed me completely. Marcus's threats about having compromising information were almost certainly empty, desperate attempts to regain some leverage. But even if they weren't, I realized I was no longer afraid of his power to shame or control me. Helena's inheritance had given me financial freedom, but this moment in the courtroom had given me something even more valuable: proof that I could stand up to Marcus's worst behavior and emerge stronger, not broken. The war wasn't over, but I had just won the most important battle, and for the first time in years, I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to win the war too. 3 months after that pivotal courthouse confrontation, I stood in the light-filled gallery space of the Crescent Harbor Arts Center, surrounded by my first solo exhibition in over a decade. The collection, titled Emergence, featured 24 paintings I had created since moving into Helena's house. Raw, emotional pieces that chronicled my journey from confinement to freedom through bold strokes and fearless color choices. The opening night had drawn an unexpectedly large crowd. Margaret Sinclair stood near a striking piece depicting a woman breaking free from golden chains, deep in conversation with a potential buyer. Dr. Sarah Chen admired a canvas where dark storm clouds gave way to brilliant sunrise, nodding approvingly at the therapeutic progress it represented. Even Detective Rodriguez had stopped by, commenting on how different I looked from the frightened woman she had first met just months earlier. "Charlotte, this is absolutely extraordinary," said Elena Martinez, the gallery director who had discovered my work through a mutual friend. "The emotional honesty in these pieces is unlike anything I've seen in years. Have you considered a book deal? Publishers are always looking for artists who can tell compelling personal stories." The idea hadn't occurred to me, but as I looked around at my work, paintings that documented not just my escape from Marcus, but my rediscovery of who I had always been underneath his control, I could envision it. A visual memoir about finding your voice after years of silence, about the courage required to rebuild your entire life from scratch. My phone buzzed with a text from Samantha, who was driving up from Portland for the exhibition. "Traffic nightmare, but I'll be there in 20 minutes. Mom and Dad are flying in tomorrow. Can you believe it? I think seeing your art finally convinced them you weren't having a breakdown." The relationship with my parents had been slowly healing over the past few months. My father, particularly, had struggled to understand how he had missed the signs of Marcus's controlling behavior. During their last visit, he had quietly apologized for dismissing my concerns, admitting that some of Marcus's tactics reminded him uncomfortably of his own father's behavior toward his mother. "I taught you to be accommodating because I thought it would keep you safe," he had said, his voice heavy with regret. "I never realized I was teaching you to accept being diminished." My mother's transformation had been even more dramatic. After witnessing Marcus's courthouse meltdown through news coverage, the story had made local headlines due to his public threats and subsequent arrest for violating the protective order. She had begun questioning her own marriage patterns. She had recently started her own therapy, exploring how she had unconsciously passed down generations of acceptance for controlling male behavior. "The courage you showed in leaving has given me permission to examine my own choices," she had told me during our last phone call. "I'm proud of you, Charlotte, prouder than I ever knew how to express." As guests continued to arrive for the exhibition opening, I caught my reflection in the gallery's large windows. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the person who had stood in the rain outside the Maplewood Heights house just months ago. My hair was longer, styled in a way that pleased me rather than Marcus's preferences. I wore a flowing emerald dress that he would have deemed too attention-seeking, but that made me feel beautiful and confident. Most importantly, my eyes held a light that had been absent for years. The divorce had been finalized just 2 weeks earlier, with Marcus ultimately agreeing to a settlement that left him with the heavily mortgaged house and most of the debt, while one retained my inheritance and received a substantial portion of his retirement accounts as compensation for years of unpaid domestic labor. His attorney had advised him that fighting further would only result in more public exposure of his abusive behavior and potentially criminal charges for the threats he had made. Marcus himself had seemingly vanished from Willowbrook after the settlement was finalized. Mutual friends reported that he had taken a position with an architectural firm in Phoenix, spinning a story about needing a fresh start after his vindictive ex-wife had made his life impossible. I felt only relief at his departure, grateful that I would never again have to worry about unexpected encounters at the grocery store or local coffee shops. My teaching career had not only survived but flourished in unexpected ways. Principal Roberts, rather than being concerned about the publicity surrounding my divorce, had been incredibly supportive, even arranging for me to teach an art therapy workshop for students dealing with difficult home situations. Several colleagues had privately shared their own stories of difficult relationships, creating a support network I never knew existed. "You've inspired some of our students in ways you might not even realize," Roberts had told me recently. "Seeing a teacher stand up for herself, rebuild her life, pursue her art dreams, that's a powerful lesson about self-respect and courage." The most unexpected development had been a commission from the Willowbrook Women's Shelter to create a mural in their main lobby, a piece depicting women of all ages and backgrounds moving from darkness into light. The project had connected me with other survivors who were rebuilding their lives, and I had begun volunteering as an art therapy facilitator, helping women express emotions they couldn't yet put into words. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversation with a young woman named Ashley who had been staring intently at one particular painting, a piece showing a figure breaking through a glass ceiling with her bare hands, light pouring through the cracks. "My husband says I'm too sensitive too," Ashley said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one could overhear. "He says I overreact to everything, that I should be grateful for how well he takes care of me. But looking at your paintings, I wonder if maybe I'm not the problem." I spent nearly an hour talking with Ashley, sharing Dr. Chen's contact information and the resources that had helped me recognize the difference between normal relationship challenges and systematic emotional abuse. As she left with a determined expression and a folder of domestic violence support materials, I realized that my art was doing more than processing my own trauma. It was helping other women recognize their own situations. Near the end of the evening, as guests began to thin out, Elena approached with exciting news. 3 major pieces have sold tonight, and I've had inquiries from galleries in Portland and Seattle about showing your work. There's also been interest from a documentary filmmaker who wants to explore stories of women who rebuilt their lives after leaving abusive relationships. The financial success was gratifying, but what meant more was the impact. A retired teacher had purchased the piece titled Breaking Free for her daughter, who was going through a difficult divorce. A young couple had bought New Dawn as a housewarming gift for the woman's sister, who had recently left an abusive marriage. Each sale represented not just validation of my artistic vision, but hope for other women who were still finding their courage. As I locked up the gallery and walked to my car, I passed a bench overlooking the harbor where I had sat many evenings over the past few months, processing the magnitude of change in my life. Helena's house glowed in the distance, lights reflecting off the water like stars fallen to earth. I thought about Helena's letter, her hope that I would be braver than she had been, that I would use her gift to write a different ending to my story. Tonight felt like the culmination of that promise. Not just financial independence or artistic success, but the profound satisfaction of living authentically for the first time. In my adult life, my phone buzzed with a message from Jessica, who was now back from her European trip and had become one of my strongest supporters. Saw the photos from tonight's opening on social media. You look absolutely radiant, and your art is stunning. Helena would be so proud of who you've become. Driving home through the quiet harbor streets, I realized that Jessica was right. Helena had given me more than money or property. She had given me permission to become the woman I was always meant to be. Tonight's exhibition wasn't just an artistic achievement. It was proof that transformation was possible at any age. That it was never too late to reclaim your voice and rebuild your life on your own terms. The frightened woman who had stood in the rain that terrible night was gone forever, replaced by someone I was still getting to know but already deeply loved. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new challenges, new opportunities to help other women find their own paths to freedom. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be alive, to be free, and to be exactly who I chose to be. 1 year to the day, after Marcus had thrown my belongings onto our rain-soaked driveway, I stood on the deck of my harbor house, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The contrast couldn't have been more perfect. That dark November night when my world had collapsed versus this radiant morning, when my new life felt limitless with possibility. The past 12 months had brought changes I never could have imagined. During those first terrifying days in the hotel room, my memoir, Brushstrokes of Freedom, An Artist's Journey from Control to Canvas, was being published by Harmony Press next month, with advance reviews calling it a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit and essential reading for anyone who has ever felt trapped by someone else's definition of love. The book had grown from Elena's suggestion into something much larger than I had initially envisioned. Working with my editor, Sarah Kim, we had crafted not just a personal story but a guide for other women navigating similar situations. Each chapter combined narrative with practical resources, red flags to recognize, steps to take, support systems to build. Dr. Chen had contributed a foreword about the psychological aspects of coercive control, while Margaret had written an appendix about legal protections available to abuse survivors. More importantly, the advance copies had already begun making a difference. Ashley, the young woman who had approached me at the gallery opening, had used the book's resources to safely leave her own controlling marriage. She now worked at the Willowbrook Women's Shelter, helping other women develop safety plans and rebuild their lives. Seeing her transformation from the frightened woman at my exhibition to a confident advocate had been one of the most rewarding aspects of this entire journey. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Saw the interview preview on Channel 7's website. You look amazing, and your message is so powerful. Can't wait to watch tonight. The television interview with investigative journalist Rebecca Torres would air this evening, part of a series on economic abuse and financial control in domestic relationships. Rebecca had approached me after reading an advance copy of the memoir, saying my story perfectly illustrated how abusers use money as a weapon, and how inheritance laws could either trap or liberate victims. What makes your case so compelling, Rebecca had explained during our pre-interview conversation, is that you show how these situations can look perfectly normal from the outside. You had a career, a beautiful home, what appeared to be a successful marriage. Most people assume abuse only happens to women who are obviously desperate or isolated. The documentary film project Elena had mentioned was also moving forward, with director Michael Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, planning to follow several women's journeys out of controlling relationships. My story would anchor the film, but we were also featuring Ashley, a former corporate executive who had left her financially abusive husband, and Maria Santos, a grandmother who had finally found the courage to leave after 43 years of marriage. The common thread Michael had observed during our last filming session is that freedom often comes with a catalyst. In your case, Helena's inheritance, but the courage to use that catalyst to actually change your life, that comes from within. This morning brought particularly exciting news. The Willowbrook School District had approved my proposal for a district-wide program, teaching emotional literacy and healthy relationship skills to high school students. The curriculum would cover recognizing manipulation, understanding consent, building self-worth, and developing communication skills, lessons I wished I had learned at 17. Instead of 41, we want students to graduate understanding that love should never make you smaller. Principal Roberts had said when announcing the program approval, your personal experience gives you credibility that traditional health education teachers simply can't match. The program would launch in the fall, and I had already been invited to present similar workshops at schools in neighboring districts. The ripple effects of speaking my truth continued to expand in ways that both humbled and energized me. As I prepared breakfast on this anniversary morning, I reflected on all the unexpected gifts that had emerged from that terrible night. The relationship with my parents was now deeper and more honest than it had ever been. My mother had completed 6 months of therapy and had begun setting boundaries with my father. For the first time in their 47-year marriage, remarkably, instead of resisting, he had embraced the changes, admitting that he preferred this more authentic version of their relationship. Watching you find your voice gave me permission to find mine, my mother had told me recently. I never realized how much of myself I had given up until I saw you reclaiming yours. Samantha and I had grown closer as well, bonding over our shared recognition of family patterns we had previously accepted as normal. She had started dating again after years of avoiding relationships, determined to apply the lessons she had learned from watching my transformation. My art had evolved beyond anything I had previously imagined possible. The upcoming exhibition, at the Portland Museum of Contemporary Art would feature a new series called Inherited Strength, exploring how trauma and healing can pass through generations of women. The centerpiece was a large installation incorporating Helena's journals, my paintings, and video testimonials from shelter residents I had worked with, a collaborative piece about breaking cycles of abuse and building legacies of empowerment. The financial security Helena had provided continued to amaze me. The trust she had established not only covered my living expenses, but allowed me to establish the Helena Blackthorne Foundation, which provided emergency grants to women leaving abusive relationships. In just 6 months, we had helped 37 women access temporary housing, legal representation, and career training. Watching these women rebuild their lives reminded me daily that Helena's gift extended far beyond what she had given me personally. Marcus, meanwhile, had faded into irrelevance in the most satisfying way possible. Mutual friends occasionally shared updates. His Phoenix job hadn't worked out. He had moved twice more. His social media presence suggested a lonely man clinging to increasingly desperate stories about his past. Some part of me felt sad for the person he might have been if he had chosen growth over control, but mostly I felt grateful for the clarity his absence provided. As the morning sun climbed higher, I settled into the studio Helena had created for me, now expanded to accommodate the larger canvases my work demanded. Today I would begin a new painting for the upcoming exhibition, a piece exploring the moment when someone realizes they have choices they hadn't seen before. My phone rang with a call from a women's shelter in Seattle, requesting a workshop for their residents. As I scheduled the session, I thought about Helena's words from her letter, "Be braver than I was. My dear, use this gift to write a completely different ending to your story." The ending I was writing included not just my own freedom but a growing network of women finding their courage, their voices, their authentic selves. Every woman who left an abusive relationship after reading my book. Every student who learned to recognize manipulation before falling victim to it. Every shelter resident who discovered her worth through art therapy. They were all part of Helena's legacy now, standing at my easel as the harbor sparkled in the morning light. I picked up my brush and began to paint. The canvas was blank, full of infinite possibility, just like the life I was still creating day by day. That terrible night when Marcus had thrown me out, believing he was destroying me. He had actually set me free. Helena's inheritance had given me the resources to escape, but the choice to transform that escape into something meaningful, that had come from within. The frightened woman who had stood in the rain was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways to our best ones, but only if we have the courage to walk through them. As I added the first bold stroke of color to the canvas, I smiled, thinking of all the women who would hear this story and recognize their own strength reflected in it. Helena's gift of freedom had become my gift to others, creating ripples of empowerment that would extend far beyond anything any of us could have imagined. The ending I was writing was just the beginning. Coming up next, you'll see two more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.